On this channel, I'm going to recommend 15 books, well, actually, secretly, slightly more, but on this playlist, 15 books, and I want you to read all 15 this year. Immediately, what comes to your mind? What excuses have you made there in terms of whether that is possible or not? Would you be able to do that? Why would reading 15 books be possible or impossible? What are the specific excuses that you would be making as to whether you could or couldn't do that? Because what we need to do is we need to pay attention to that voice, because that is the voice of the inner critic. And that is book 1 on this series, Embracing Your Inner Critic by Hal and Sidra Stone. This book has been absolutely pivotal in my development and in my self-discovery, because I didn't realize just how critical my inner voice was, and I also had no idea where it came from. And that's what has really helped me with this. It's helped me to understand not just what it's saying, but why it's saying it and where that voice came from to begin with. One thing that's particularly important to be aware of as we start to discuss a book like this is why you've got an inner critic to begin with. And it's there for 2 reasons: to help you avoid feelings of pain and to help you avoid feelings of shame. They're the main things that we need to be zeroed in on, really laser focused on, because why on earth would we want to willingly feel like that? It's difficult. It's going to bring up a lot of vulnerability within us, but that's what we need to be aware of, that when the inner critic starts to attack, when we come up with these horrible things that we say to ourselves in our own mind, or all these excuses or whatever else it might be, what it's really doing is helping us to avoid those feelings. It's helping us to avoid the pain that will be associated with them, and if we failed, and also the shame as well. So what really is going to be useful for all this is not to judge the inner critic. It's definitely not to banish it and push it further and further away, because all that's going to happen is it'll just keep on working behind the scenes. Below where we're even aware of, at the unconscious level, it's still going to have that big pull over us. So what we need to do is to bring it up to our conscious awareness and start to ask it where it came from, what it's trying to do, how it's trying to do something in a way which is maybe a little bit distorted, and how it might need a bit of help as well. That's why the whole point of a book like this is to embrace the inner critic. It's not to banish it, it's not to punish it or anything else like that. We need to bring it on board as a part of us so that we can actually move forwards with that voice as well. Because as you'll start to realize by reading a book like this, a lot of this isn't actually our voice at all. It's just an internalized version of other voices that we have heard throughout our lives. So on page 23, and the book is absolutely littered with amazing questions that will really help you on a practical angle. But as early as page 23, I had a lot of breakthroughs and a lot of insights straight away when it asks questions like this. When you're trying to get used to your inner critic, and you come across a statement that it's saying to you, let's say it's giving you a really clear reason as to why you shouldn't do something, or why you're not the type of person that should even be thinking of doing what it is that you're looking at doing. And that could be from a positive angle as well, like in terms of just having low self-esteem. You might be really wanting to get a certain job, but the inner critic is saying, no, you're not worthy of that. It's worth being aware of on page 23. Does this statement sound like somebody that you already know, or that somebody that you used to know? Is this actually the voice of your mum or your dad or a teacher or a caregiver that you had growing up, and you're just repeating this voice over and over? Does it actually sound like you, or is it the voice and the language of somebody else? And it can be really useful as well, again, following on the same set of exercises, to be able to think about what your mum or your dad or your caregivers or your teachers, whoever you're around with, could be priests, what were their favourite ways of judging other people? What is it that they were saying that was completely unacceptable in others? Because that's going to have a big impact in terms of what comes to be understood as acceptable or unacceptable within yourself. And it might be that you get all the way into your 30s or your 40s, and having never critically examined that thought and that judgment and that evaluation, that we still judge ourselves according to those standards, which we never really judged ourselves with to begin with. It was always someone else judging us according to those standards. So when we start to embrace the inner critic, we're trying to really realize what's actually going on, where those voices originated, and what is it that we can do about that to actually start to reverse those processes. Again, moving on to some of the other questions in here, just to help keep this really practical, because like I say, this book is just so practical. What were the worst characteristics that a person could have according to whoever is relevant for you. It could be according to your friends growing up. Again, it could be according to caregivers. It could be according to people that you see on TV or in film or in games that you play. But what is it that is encouraged actively and what is discouraged actively in other people? What does that look like? And how has that also helped to shift your opinion as well of yourself? Because really what we need to do is we need to realize that this inner critic voice, it started to develop when we were extremely young. So really that critical voice is more of the voice of a child, which is just trying to be safe. It's trying to not be ashamed of itself. It's trying to avoid feelings of pain and shame for that reason. And that's what we need to try to take into account, rather than judging ourselves unnecessarily harshly when we start to hear these terms and these really vicious statements that we say about ourselves. It's realizing this is maybe the voice of a child. So the voice of a younger version of you, and it's screaming out for help in a way which it can't directly say. So it's going to have to try to get your attention in one way or another. That might be getting your attention in the way of a certain feeling or a certain tension in one part of your body. It might be a verbal idea that you're hearing in your head. It might be more of an image or a sensation, but it's getting your attention in some way, and it's up to us to pay attention to it and learn how to integrate it into our personality in a much healthier way, to be able to update it. So if you're in your 30s listening to this, it's realizing that actually this voice is the voice of, let's say, a 7-year-old, and making sure it's aware and up to date with the fact that you're living in a 30-year-old body in very different circumstances compared to your childhood home. That could be extremely useful. And in that way there, we're not banishing the inner critic. We're not pushing it away and saying, stay away from us. Then, because all that's going to happen there is we're going to just increase that pressure, and then the voice is going to get stronger and stronger. What we need to do is realize that we can actually, and this is the subtitle for the book, learn how to turn that self-criticism into a creative asset. That can only happen through embracing this voice. It's never going to happen otherwise. And for me, on this journey of self-discovery, it's this embracing of vulnerability that has really helped to change things, because all of a sudden I've been aware of what blocks I've been putting in place, and actually when I remove those blocks, the energy just flows naturally anyway. I don't have to put in any extra effort, because it took actually a lot of effort to actually keep a lot of that armoring and those blocks in place to begin with, and it was just wasted effort that I was just frustrating my own energy and my own potential, and it just wasn't a good situation to be involved in. So for me, getting in touch with that critical voice, that judgmental voice, that evaluative voice, whatever it is, like in terms of the way that you prefer to word this, it's understanding that actually it can be on your team. It can be on your side. And if you can walk into the future hand in hand alongside that younger version of yourself with that critical voice, suddenly life becomes a lot more manageable. It's a lot easier. I found that there's a lot more inner peace and a lot more inner quiet that now that I'm in my 30s compared to when I was definitely a child, teenager, and I'd say up to the age of around 28, where I just was constantly battling certain moods and just difficulties that just they didn't have to be there, and nobody told me that. And that's why if I could go back in time, like with a few of these other books, if I could just say, 10-year-old Billy, please read this and please put it into practice. It's not you. You're not going mad. You're not going insane. It's just the voices of other people that you've just internalized and just questioned. You've just accepted without questioning. Suddenly life becomes a lot easier. So the best possible way to start this process, and that's exactly why I started with that question of, if I said to you, read these 15 books this year, you might say things like, well, I'm not a reader, I've not got the attention span, I could never do it. Whatever the reasons are for that, that's just the critical voice that's speaking to you. I'm not expecting to actually read all 15 of these if a lot of these books don't appeal to you, but it's understanding that excuse-making mechanism that's in our head and learning to inquire and get to know that in a lot more of a detailed way and a much more of an embracing way. And we'll start to be able to understand how this relates to other people with the next book in the series, when we start to look at this idea of the lost art of mentoring as well. But before I get too ahead of myself and before I start to explain that, all I'd like to do for now is to introduce one absolutely cornerstone book of this entire series. And it's so easy to read as well. It's about 200 pages. Embracing Your Inner Critic. It'll make the rest of the journey so much simpler. And if I could go back in time and tell myself to read one book, that would be the book. So if I can pass that on to you, then that'd be wonderful. And that'd be my job done. If you like the other 14 books in this series, then they'll be available just on the right hand side or just below, or maybe even popping up at this point in time. But we're going to take this further forwards and have a look at how we can use an idea like this to be able to encourage mentoring, and what is it about those people that we look up to that we can start to see within ourselves. All of this is a process of building self-esteem, as you'll start to see. Embracing your inner critic with part 2 just on the next video.